Picture this. You are standing in the shadows of a marble corridor in the Forbidden City, the year 1644 AD. The silk slippers on your feet make no sound against the cold stone as you witness something that will haunt you forever. Through an ornate doorway, you see a young boy, perhaps 12 years old, being dragged toward a wooden table by men in dark robes. His screams echo off the palace walls as he realizes what is about to happen to him. The metallic scent of blood mingles with burning incense as you watch the most brutal initiation ritual in imperial history unfold before your eyes. This child is about to join the ranks of the palace eunuchs, servants who traded their manhood for proximity to power, only to discover that their sacrifice would lead them down a path of unimaginable suffering and grotesque endings that would make even the most hardened executioner turn away in horror. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The practice of castration for palace service spans millennia and crossed continents, from the harems of Constantinople to the imperial courts of Beijing, from the temples of ancient Egypt to the royal chambers of Persia. But what history books rarely tell you is what happened to these men after their mutilation. The gruesome reality of their daily existence, the psychological torment that drove many to madness, and the horrific ways their lives would ultimately end, all in service to rulers who saw them as nothing more than useful tools to be discarded when they outlived their purpose. The process of creating a eunuch was itself a testament to human cruelty that would shock modern sensibilities. In China during the Ming Dynasty, families would sell their sons to professional castrators who operated in back alley clinics throughout the empire. The procedure, performed without anesthesia, involved the complete removal of both the penis and testicles using a sharp knife or razor. The wound would be sealed with hot oil or boiling water, and a metal tube would be inserted to prevent the urethra from closing. The mortality rate was staggering, with estimates suggesting that only 6 out of every 10 boys survived the initial operation. Those who did survive faced weeks of agony as their wounds slowly healed, many developing infections that would plague them for the remainder of their shortened lives. But surviving the castration was only the beginning of their ordeal. The successful candidates would be sold to palace recruiters who evaluated them like livestock at market. Physical appearance, intelligence, and potential for loyalty were assessed with the cold calculation of merchants examining goods for trade. The most attractive and intelligent would be purchased for imperial service, while others might find themselves in the households of wealthy nobles or religious institutions. Those deemed unsuitable would be abandoned to die on the streets, their sacrifice having purchased them nothing but suffering. The palace eunuchs who entered imperial service discovered that their castration was merely the first of many humiliations they would endure. In the Ottoman Empire, the white eunuchs who served in the seraglio were subjected to a complex hierarchy that determined every aspect of their existence. New arrivals, called novices, were assigned to senior eunuchs who would train them in palace protocol while subjecting them to physical and sexual abuse that their castrated state made them powerless to resist. The psychological impact of this treatment, combined with the hormonal changes caused by their castration, created a population of servants who were simultaneously privileged and tormented, powerful within the palace walls, yet utterly vulnerable to the whims of their masters. The daily life of these castrated servants revealed the true cost of their sacrifice. In the Chinese imperial court, eunuchs were required to perform duties that ranged from the mundane to the degrading. They served as personal attendants to the emperor and his concubines, helping with intimate tasks that their castrated state supposedly made safe. They cleaned chamber pots, bathed their masters, and assisted with clothing and grooming. But their most psychologically damaging duty was serving as intermediaries in the complex sexual politics of the imperial harem. These men, robbed of their own sexuality, were forced to facilitate the sexual encounters of others, arranging meetings between the emperor and his concubines, while being eternally denied such pleasures themselves. The physical consequences of castration extended far beyond the initial trauma of the operation. Eunuchs typically developed distinctive physical characteristics that marked them as different from other men. They often grew tall and thin, with soft, feminine features and voices that remained high-pitched throughout their lives. Many developed what modern medicine would recognize as severe hormonal imbalances, leading to mood swings, depression, and other psychological disorders that were poorly understood in their time. Their bones became brittle, making them susceptible to fractures and deformities. Many suffered from urinary problems throughout their lives, as the brutal surgical techniques often damaged the urethral passages, leading to painful infections and difficulty with basic bodily functions. The social isolation experienced by palace eunuchs was perhaps even more devastating than their physical suffering. Cut off from the possibility of marriage and family, they existed in a liminal space between male and female, neither fully one nor the other in the eyes of society. In many cultures, they were forbidden from interacting with intact men outside of their official duties, creating a segregated caste of the sexually mutilated who could only find companionship among their fellow sufferers. This isolation bred its own forms of cruelty, as eunuchs competed viciously among themselves for the favor of their masters, knowing that imperial approval was their only protection against the constant threat of disposal. The power structures within eunuch communities were brutal and complex. Senior eunuchs wielded tremendous influence over their juniors, often replicating the same patterns of abuse they had experienced in their own youth. In the Byzantine Empire, the chief eunuch of the imperial household could determine the fate of hundreds of castrated servants, deciding who would receive favorable assignments and who would be relegated to the most degrading tasks. These power games created an atmosphere of constant fear and suspicion, where betrayal was common and loyalty was always conditional on immediate advantage. The relationship between eunuchs and their imperial masters was characterized by a fundamental contradiction that would ultimately seal their fate. While their castrated state made them supposedly trustworthy guardians of imperial women and secrets, this same condition made them objects of suspicion and disgust. Emperors and sultans who relied on their services often harbored deep resentment toward these mutilated men who had been given access to their most private moments. This resentment would manifest in sudden purges, arbitrary punishments, and casual cruelties that reminded the eunuchs of their expendable status. The accumulation of wealth and property by successful eunuchs created another source of tension that would ultimately contribute to their downfall. In many imperial courts, eunuchs were allowed to accumulate personal fortunes through their service, sometimes becoming incredibly wealthy through gifts, bribes, and various forms of corruption. However, their inability to produce heirs meant that their wealth had no natural inheritors, making them attractive targets for confiscation by their imperial masters. The knowledge that their accumulated riches could be seized at any moment added another layer of anxiety to their already precarious existence. As these castrated servants aged, their value to their masters diminished rapidly. Young eunuchs might be prized for their beauty and energy, but older ones became increasingly burdensome to maintain. Their hormonal imbalances often led to rapid physical deterioration, with many developing health problems that made them less useful as servants. The palace administrators, who had once competed to acquire their services, began to see them as liabilities, consuming resources without providing adequate returns. This shift in perception marked the beginning of the end for these unfortunate men, setting the stage for the horrific conclusions to their tragic lives. The decline of aging eunuchs in imperial service followed predictable patterns that revealed the cold calculations behind their initial recruitment. Palace administrators maintained detailed records of each eunuch's productivity, health status, and remaining usefulness, treating human beings like machinery that depreciated over time. When a eunuch's physical condition deteriorated to the point where he could no longer perform his duties effectively, he would be transferred to progressively less prestigious assignments until he found himself relegated to the most menial tasks in the palace hierarchy. The first sign of impending doom for many eunuchs was their reassignment to cleaning duties in the palace's most remote sections. Former personal attendants to emperors and concubines would find themselves scrubbing floors in forgotten corridors, emptying waste from kitchens, or maintaining the palace's extensive network of underground tunnels and storage areas. These assignments were not merely demotions, they were death sentences carried out slowly through neglect and isolation. Cut off from the palace's main social networks and deprived of the gifts and privileges that had sustained them in their prime, these abandoned eunuchs faced starvation, disease, and despair in equal measure. The psychological impact of this decline was devastating for men who had once wielded considerable influence within palace walls. Eunuchs who had grown accustomed to being consulted on matters of state, who had managed vast household budgets, or who had served as confidants to powerful rulers, suddenly found themselves treated as invisible nuisances by their former colleagues. The hormonal imbalances caused by their castration made them particularly vulnerable to depression and mood disorders, conditions that were exacerbated by their social isolation and declining status. Many began to exhibit behaviors that palace officials labeled as madness, talking to themselves, refusing to eat, or engaging in repetitive rituals that served no apparent purpose. In the Ottoman court, aging eunuchs faced a particularly cruel fate, known as the retirement to the old palace. This practice involved transferring elderly or infirm eunuchs to a separate complex where they were supposedly cared for in their declining years. In reality, the old palace functioned as a dumping ground where unwanted eunuchs were left to die with minimal food, medical care, or human contact. Visitors to these facilities described scenes that resembled medieval plague houses more than retirement homes, with dozens of skeletal figures wandering aimlessly through crumbling chambers, their minds broken by decades of psychological trauma, and their bodies failing from untreated medical conditions. The Chinese imperial system developed its own methods for disposing of unwanted eunuchs that were no less cruel but more systematic in their execution. During periodic palace purges, usually coinciding with the death of an emperor or major political upheavals, hundreds of eunuchs would be rounded up and executed en masse. These killings were often carried out using methods specifically chosen to maximize suffering, such as slow strangulation, flaying alive, or burial while still conscious. The justification for these mass murders was typically framed in terms of eliminating corruption or reducing palace expenses, but the underlying motivation was the new regime's desire to eliminate witnesses to the previous ruler's secrets and excesses. Some eunuchs attempted to escape their fate by fleeing the palace grounds, but their distinctive physical appearance and lack of survival skills outside the imperial court made successful escape nearly impossible. Chinese records describe manhunts for escaped eunuchs that treated them as dangerous criminals rather than desperate men seeking freedom. Those who were recaptured faced punishments that were designed to serve as examples to others who might consider similar attempts. These punishments often involved prolonged torture sessions where the fugitive eunuchs were subjected to techniques that exploited their physical vulnerabilities, such as crushing their already fragile bones or inflicting wounds on their scarred genital areas. The few eunuchs who managed to survive into old age within the palace system faced a final humiliation that stripped away whatever dignity they had managed to preserve. As their usefulness declined and their maintenance costs increased, they would be assigned to train the newest generation of castrated boys, forced to participate in perpetuating the same system that had destroyed their own lives. These elderly eunuchs became complicit in the abuse of children, teaching young victims how to suppress their pain, how to navigate the palace's dangerous social hierarchies, and how to perform the intimate services that would define their existence. The psychological toll of this forced participation in the cycle of abuse often proved to be the final breaking point for men who had already endured decades of suffering. The stories of these castrated servants remind us that history's palaces, for all their golden splendor and artistic magnificence, were built upon foundations of unimaginable human suffering. These men sacrificed everything in pursuit of proximity to power, only to discover that their mutilation had purchased them nothing but a lifetime of torment and a death devoid of dignity. Their gruesome fates serve as eternal testimony to the price paid by those who became mere instruments in the machinery of absolute power, their voices silenced by history, but their suffering echoing through the corridors of time.